Welcome back to Discipleship and Family Ministry. What I want to talk about right now is something that you've probably heard at some point, and that is the 9 out of 10 statistic about youth dropouts from church. The statistic is 88%, or 9 out of 10 youth drop out of church soon after high school, soon after they graduate. Now, what I want to focus on is not so much the statistic itself. I've shown in other places that you can find how that statistic was probably completely false to begin with, and in fact, it's been proven that that's not quite the dropout rate that we see. But what I want us to understand is, ask the question, why is it that this statistic caught on so quickly and spread so far? You see, as I've shown in other places, somewhere in the 1980s, somebody took an informal survey that really didn't have any statistical reliability in the first place, and they concluded that 9 out of 10 youth drop out after high school, drop out of church. As I said, I don't want to focus on the statistic. What I want to focus on is the fact that that statistic somehow caught on and spread like wildfire, such that within a few years of that time when this statistic came out in the 80s and 90s, within a few years of that, everybody at every conference, it seemed like, was quoting this statistic and coming up with ways to fix this problem. So I want to think about, why did it spread so fast and spread so far? Well, I think part of the reason is because there was, at that time, especially in the 1990s, a growing dissatisfaction with youth ministry. There was a growing dissatisfaction with youth ministry, such that people, when they heard this, were willing to jump right on the bandwagon and say, youth ministry is broken. Let's figure out some way to fix youth ministry. We're losing all of these youth. But why was it that there was such a dissatisfaction with youth ministry at this time that caused people to accept a statistic that was spurious in the first place? Well, I think one of the reasons is we started seeing in the 80s and in the 90s the first generation of people who were theologically trained youth ministers and who were going into youth ministry not merely because they just had a heart for youth and a passion for youth, though that was certainly part of it, but they really felt that they were called to be in pastoral ministry roles, not simply to want somebody to play with the youth and somebody to do some activities with the youth and somebody to spend time with the youth and keep them from falling away during their youth years, so to speak, but rather people who felt passionate about really discipling and pastoring youth. And so because we had a generation of people who had that sense, but then we also had an expectation that these people were supposed to be entertainers of the youth. If you remember that one-eared Mickey Mouse diagram that we looked at, remember that we talked about, that it was basically keep the youth out there for a while, and then we'll bring them back in at some point in the future when they can be part of the real church, the big church. And so I believe we had a conflict, sort of a frustrating conflict, a tension between the expectations in the churches that had been going on for several decades by this point and the calling of the youth ministers, in which they had a sense of their desire was to disciple, to be pastoral with the youth, also to be theologically trained. And so they had this desire coupled with an expectation in the church of being, in essence, a glorified event planner. And so there was a tension in youth ministry that arose. And so this dissatisfaction, this tension, took the form of grabbing on to any sort of dissatisfaction, any sort of statistic that says this is not being successful, and to take that and run with it in a way that probably wasn't helpful, but does highlight some things that were going on in youth ministry toward the end of the 20th century. Now, you had this growing dissatisfaction that continues in the 90s and into the early 21st century, this dissatisfaction with youth ministry. Now, there are several things that are birthed from this, one of those being family ministry, an emphasis on family ministry. Now, I'm not saying that family ministry wasn't around before that. Clearly it was. And there were people such as Mark DeVries and Richard Ross who were speaking about family ministry before this time. But as for family ministry really becoming a movement, that began in the early 21st century, in part because of a long-standing dissatisfaction by that point with many different aspects of youth ministry. So we started hearing about different family ministry, and then people began talking about family ministry models. Now let me take you forward to about 2006, 2007, in which I was in a church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and we were doing family ministry, but we didn't even call it family ministry. It was simply part of the larger discipleship strategy in our church, and frankly, at that point, I was so focused on simply doing what it took to make our things work well in our church that I really wasn't even frankly paying attention to this larger discussion that was going on at this time. We were doing family ministry because we felt called to do it, because we felt like this was an effective means of discipleship to try to help families learn to disciple their children. In the midst of this, there was a whole discussion going on, and Randy Stinson had recently become the dean of one of the schools here at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and was bringing with him an emphasis on family ministry. Now, when I came on to Southern Seminary in 2007, we didn't have a name for what we were talking about. We didn't have a description for what we felt like we ought to do. In fact, what it looked like to us at that time was that there were only a couple of different ways of doing family ministry. One of those was family integrated ministry. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but family integrated ministry, which was basically saying we need to wipe out youth ministry, we need to wipe out children's ministry, we need to wipe out anything that is age graded and age organized, and we need to replace it with something where that everything is intergenerational in the church. So a complete intergenerational church that emphasizes the discipleship of children by their parents. That's a family integrated model of wiping out all of these age-organized structures and replacing them with, or really just not so much replacing them as completely eliminating them and having instead simply a church that is completely intergenerational. So that's one possibility that we see. The other possibility we saw on the other side was what we might call a family-based approach, Now, in a family-based approach, that comes from Mark DeVries from a book that he wrote called Family-Based Youth Ministry, that early on was really kind of pointing towards some of the things that we're saying now long before it became popular to be saying it. Mark DeVries, Family-Based Youth Ministry. But what Mark DeVries primarily proposed was simply adding or adapting the structures you have or adding new activities to what you're already doing that bring in an intergenerational emphasis into the church. It's what we've kind of talked about primarily as church as family, that the church is a multi-generational family, and his approach really emphasized how the church can be a multi-generational family, and it was family-based youth ministry. Now, it would be, by default, by being intergenerational, would bring in and would involve the parents, but the focus wasn't the involvement of the parents as it simply was that it would be intergenerational and adding activities to what you're already doing that would bring the generations together. Now, those two seemed like the only options, or at least were the only clear options. Family integrated, wipe it all out. Or family-based, add more activities to what we're already doing. And family-based, I knew from experience from having led a church in this direction at one point, that simply adding new activities to what you're already doing eventually ends up with an exhausted staff and an exhausted church because you simply got too many things going on because frankly, most of our churches already have plenty, perhaps too much, going on already. And so we really wanted to forge a different path other than family integrated or family based. And that became known as family equipping. Now, where I got that title from, family equipping, was from in a book that's Pastoral Leadership for Manhood and Womanhood. There's an article in there that mentioned the church as an equipping center for families. And when I ran across that, we didn't have a name for what we were talking about. We simply knew it was something between those two emphases. And when I saw that an equipping center for families, it struck me, that's it. That's what we're talking about here. We want a church to be a family equipping church. And what we meant by family equipping is that we don't, with family integrated, simply wipe out all of the structures that are age organized, but neither do we, as in family based, simply add to what's already going on. Rather, we take what is going on and we transform it. We take what's going on in youth ministry. We take what's going on in children's ministry and we transform what's going on. We metamorphose that in a way that it does more than it did before. And what I mean by it does more than it did before is that we take those things we're doing with youth and children and redesign those so that they involve the generations in the church and such that they involve particularly the parents and equip the parents to be able to disciple their children. And that became known as the family equipping model of church ministry. And that's really what we really promoted and has really caught on in so many different ways. You'll find that in many, many different places now, but it's something that we came up with all the way back in 2007 and was first published in the book that I edited, Perspectives on Family Ministry, where we laid out these three general models, family-based, family equipping, and family integrated there for the first time. And so here's one of the ways that I kind of describe and explain the different models. I use mathematical symbols. On the one hand, we've got, for the division sign, we have a segmented programmatic approach. And you're thinking that's not one of the three models you mentioned, and it's because it's not really a model of family ministry. What I'm calling segmented programmatic is the church as we sort of inherited it from the 20th century particularly. And what I mean by that, inheriting it, is that church that is segmented, that is, it's comprehensively segmented by ages, such that people go to church and it's viewed as the best possible way of discipling people, to organize them according to special interest or to organize them according to their ages, segmented. But then it's also programmatic, that if we want to disciple people, if somebody asks, well, we need to disciple people, or we need to train them to be evangelists, whatever it may be, that our first recourse is, well, let's run a program to do that. Let's have a class for 13 weeks to do that. Let's solve the issues that we see in our churches with programs. So that's a segmented, programmatic church. And the reason I use the division sign to explain the segmented, programmatic church is because it sees the primary way of discipling people to divide them and to teach them separately, to divide them according to programs and according to ages and according to special interests, and to train them for the faith, to disciple them in that way. Now, the problem with the segmented, programmatic church is it short circuits both of those two emphases we talked about earlier to do with family ministry. It short circuits the church as a family because of the fact that it segments everyone. It cuts everybody into pieces, we might say. It segments them into groups according to special interest or according to age. And by doing that, by segmenting them, it short circuits church as family. That is to say, church as a multi-generational community of believers in Jesus Christ that are learning to live out their faith by learning from people who are different from themselves, different ages, different types of people, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different races, all these different groupings, they are mingled together in church's family. But a segmented, programmatic church sees the first and foremost way of discipling them as being cutting them into different groups, separating them into different groups, so segmented. But also the programmatic part of segmented programmatic short circuits the second emphasis we talked about to do with family ministry, the family as church. Because as we talked about earlier, family as church is recognizing that the primary place where children are to be trained in their faith, the most fundamental place they're to be trained is by their parents in their family. Not ruling out what the church does, not saying that the church is to be shortchanged in what it does, and not forgetting that the church is the primary means by which God, His kingdom presence, is multiplied in the world, but recognizing that the most basic unit of discipleship is the family. The first and best small group, we might say, is the family. Well, if we say that it's dependent on church programs to disciple people, then we lose sight of the fact of family as church. That family is to be a microcosm of the church in which ideally families are living out the gospel together with their children, in their families. Parents are guiding them and discipling them, not by means of a program, but by means of their personal relationship and guidance with their children. So a segmented programmatic church, the segmentation, it short circuits church as family. The programs can short circuit family as church if they are seen as the primary means by which people are discipled. So the segmented programmatic model isn't really a family ministry model at all. It is a model that is frequent in our churches, is still popular in many churches, is still viewed as the ideal in our churches in many instances. But I don't believe it's a way that effectively disciples people in a way that reflects both family as church and church as family. And so I use the division sign to symbolize the segmented programmatic church. So now let's move to the three family ministry models that we've already mentioned. We could say on the one end of just going all the way into the opposite end of the spectrum from a segmented programmatic church is a family integrated church. And I'm going to use the subtraction sign for a family integrated church. And I don't mean that in a disparaging sense or anything like that, but it is a type of model that subtracts or takes away certain programs from the church with the belief that by doing that, by subtracting youth ministry, children's ministry, all of those things, that the result is a more faithful and more effective way of discipling people. Now, the strength of the family integrated church, we can speak of several strengths. In the first place, we can speak of its simplicity. A family integrated church is simple church at its simplest. There's not really any programs that are going on that are organized according to any ages or organized in any way. No extra programs that have to be going on of Sunday school in all different age groups. No need to get all the volunteers to teach all the Sunday school classes because people are together in pretty much every instance. So that's one of the strengths, is its simplicity. And it does truly call men to disciple their families, to take the lead in that. But some of the criticisms of a family integrated church include the fact that, number one, what about people who live in broken families, in fragmented families? Can they really adapt to a family integrated model in such a way that they can be discipled at the same level and in the same ways that everybody else is experiencing discipleship? Another one, and I think the primary weakness of a family integrated church, is it's really difficult, I would say just about impossible, to get an established church, to move an established church from a segmented programmatic model or a model that has all these different programs going on, to move it all the way over to family integrated model without in the process causing the church to be broken into pieces. That's a hard transition to make, an almost impossible one. And so in that, I would say that a family integrated church, if it's to work, and if you're called to a family integrated church, if you're called to lead one, almost the best way to do that is to start one. That is to say, to do church planting and to start it from scratch. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to move a church peaceably from a segmented model all the way over to a family integrated model. And so we've got the division sign for segmented programmatic all the way on at one end. All the way over on the other end, we have a minus sign for taking things away for a family integrated church. Now, we could also say a plus sign, an addition sign, and we'll say that that's for a family-based church, one in which you add specific programs and specific activities to what you're already doing. You add them to bring the generations together and in the process to equip or at least to involve parents in discipling their children. That's a family-based church. Now, the one drawback on a family-based church, as I hinted at earlier, is most of our churches are already doing plenty, if not too much, in their churches in terms of activities. The calendar's already packed. And when you begin adding more and more and more activities, the question becomes, how can parents really be discipling their children if they're spending so much time in church activities? How do we expect people to step out and to be witnesses in their neighborhood if they're doing that many church activities, so many different ones that we've got on the calendar? And so that's the challenge of a family-based church. The other challenge I see in a family-based church is that in a family-based church, it's very easy if somebody doesn't want to engage in discipling their family. If you have parents that just don't feel comfortable doing that, they can kind of sit back and coast and let the church take care of it. In other words, they don't really come to the forefront of us noticing these parents, they're not really discipling their kids. We may not be aware of that. It's easy for some parents who jump in and say, yes, I'm going to do this. Yes, I'm going to disciple my children. And they can do that in a family-based church. But it's also easy for others to kind of step back and slide and just involve their kids in the church activities, but not they themselves being involved in discipling their children. Now, I'd say one of the strengths of a family-based church is it's easiest to make the transition from a segmented church to a family-based church. It's a lot easier. And so it may be that a family-based model is a great, in fact, an amazing first step for a church to make. If they're wanting to move toward being a family equipping church, then they could take family-based, add a few programs to help people get used to this idea in a family-based church on the way to a family equipping church. But a family-based church is a hard place to stay for long. It will tend, I think, to slip back into a segmented model, or it will need to be pressed forward into a family equipping model before it's over. But that's our addition sign, adding activities in a family-based church. Now, the last one of all is the one that Dr. Stinson and I developed this as the kind of the theological foundations as a model based on our interaction with a cohort of like-minded individuals that in the beginning included Brian Haynes and Jay Struther and Steve Wright, and later Rob Reno and some others joined in with this vision for family equipping churches. And that is, as I noted earlier, simply taking the things that you are already doing and metamorphosing, changing those things that you are already doing to do something more than they did before. In other words, what you do is in the planning processes for children's and youth events, children's and youth activities, children's and youth programs, everything you do, you work into the planning, how will we metamorphose this? How will we change this? How will we adapt this so that we involve the generations and we involve the parents in what's going on in this particular activity? Now, I go into a lot of specifics and a lot of details in this in the book, The Family Ministry Field Guide, talking about the very specific ways that we can do this. We can make these changes in our churches. But the vision of family equipping is that we have a church that is both church as family and family as church, and we do that by taking the things that we're already doing, not adding any new activities, but taking all the activities we are already doing with youth and children and metamorphosing those so that they multiply. And that's our sign for the family equipping one, is multiplication, is that we multiply what they're doing by having them do more than they did before. Metamorphosing those, tweaking those events that we're already doing such that they involve the generations and that they equip the parents. That's what we want to do in a family equipping church. And so a family equipping model is a model that is about multiplication. It is taking what you're already doing and multiplying its impact by reworking it, replanning it in such a way that it calls parents and equips parents to disciple their children and involves generations beyond simply the youth or the children or whatever grade level is involved in that event, that we work on it in such a way, we develop it in such a way that it involves not merely that age group, but it draws in people from across the generations so that we can model the church that God has created us, has called us together to be, which is a church in which it's not simply focused on one age group, one grouping of any sort, one particular special interest group, but rather it's all of us learning to be the body of Christ by having to rub shoulders with people who aren't like us, by having to deal with people and learn from people who maybe have different assumptions than we have, who look at the world differently than we do, so that we can see and experience and be discipled within the manifold beauty of what God has created to be this body of Christ, the church.